The first thing I noticed was the plant missing from my desk. Not the framed degree from Columbia, not the client awards, not even the family photo I kept turned slightly away from the hallway so people wouldn't stare at it during meetings. Just the plant. A small white orchid I'd managed to keep alive for 3 years inside a building where everyone eventually learned how disposable they were. I stopped outside my office and watched Melissa, my boss's favorite employee, laughing while 2 interns carried boxes of my things into the hallway like someone had already signed my obituary. She looked up, froze for half a second, then smiled too quickly and said, "Oh, no one told you yet?" That sentence explained everything. The sudden HR meeting placed on my calendar at 4:30 p.m. The revoked access to the budget server that morning. The way my manager refused to make eye contact during the leadership call. I should have felt embarrassed standing there while strangers touched my belongings, but honestly, I felt something worse. Relief. Because the moment I saw my office reassigned before they officially fired me, I realized they were rushing. And people only rush when they're terrified someone might still know where the bodies are buried. I was 28 years old, the youngest operations strategist at Aldervane Capital, and for almost 4 years I'd built systems that saved executives from disasters they later pretended never happened. I knew which clients were secretly threatening lawsuits, which department heads manipulated quarterly reports before board reviews, and which vendors kept getting approved because somebody upstairs owed somebody else a favor. I also knew exactly when the atmosphere inside a company changes from competitive to predatory, and 3 weeks earlier, I started noticing the signs. Conversations stopped when I entered conference rooms. My approvals suddenly required additional oversight. Melissa, who used to ask me for help formatting presentations, began attending executive lunches she had absolutely no clearance to attend. Then came the Thursday audit call where my manager, Richard, calmly blamed me for missing compliance documents that I personally uploaded myself on March 11 at 8:14 p.m. I remember staring at him through the conference room glass while he lied with the kind of confidence people develop when they think the outcome has already been decided. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just opened my notebook and wrote down one sentence: "They're moving too early." Because if they believed deleting me would erase what I knew, they'd already made the mistake that would eventually destroy them. The HR meeting lasted exactly 11 minutes, which told me the decision had been finalized long before I walked in. The woman from Human Resources, Denise, someone I'd trained on internal reporting software less than a year earlier, kept her eyes fixed on a printed folder while she repeated phrases that sounded rehearsed enough to survive a lawsuit. Department restructuring. Leadership realignment. Performance concerns. Richard sat beside her pretending to look disappointed, though he couldn't fully hide the impatience underneath it. He wanted me out quickly. Cleanly. Quietly. When Denise slid the severance agreement across the table, I noticed the signature line at the bottom was already dated for the following morning. That detail almost made me smile. They expected me to panic. Instead, I asked one question. Who approved the transition of my client accounts? Richard answered too quickly. Executive leadership. Not names. Just titles. Another mistake. I signed nothing, thanked Denise for her time, and handed over my access badge without resistance. Richard looked visibly relieved, like he expected tears or accusations or some emotional scene he could later describe as proof I was unstable. But silence unsettles dishonest people more than anger ever will. I stood, smoothed the sleeve of my blazer, and walked out carrying only my purse and laptop charger while Melissa avoided looking directly at me from my former office. What none of them understood was that I'd spent years preparing for the possibility that someone inside the company would eventually try to erase me. Strategic employees survive by documenting everything. 3 months earlier, after discovering discrepancies in vendor payments connected to Richard's division, I created a protected compliance archive inside a legacy reporting folder almost nobody in the building remembered existed anymore. The folder had once belonged to an executive who retired after the pandemic, and because IT never fully migrated the permissions during a server transition, my credentials still retained limited access through an older authentication pathway. I discovered it accidentally during a midnight reconciliation project in February. At the time, I almost reported the security oversight. Instead, something told me to wait. By the time I reached the parking garage that evening, my personal phone buzzed with 6 new notifications. Access revoked. Corporate email disabled. Remote login terminated. They moved fast. Faster than policy actually allowed. Sitting inside my car, I opened my personal laptop using the hotspot from my phone and tested the old archive pathway one final time. The folder opened immediately. I stared at hundreds of files arranged neatly by date, altered invoices, reimbursement approvals, internal Slack exports, and signed vendor amendments, even a scanned expense report from Richard charging a client retention dinner at a Miami hotel on the same weekend he claimed to be attending a compliance summit in Chicago. My pulse stayed calm while I downloaded encrypted copies onto an external drive I kept attached to my keychain. Then I found the file that explained everything. A draft acquisition proposal dated 6 days earlier. Aldervane Capital was preparing for a private merger with a larger financial group, and according to internal notes, Richard's division had been flagged during preliminary due diligence for potential reporting inconsistencies. Suddenly the timing made sense. They weren't firing me because I failed. They were removing the employee most likely to connect the inconsistencies back to leadership before the acquisition finalized. My phone rang while I was reading the document. Unknown number. I answered without speaking. After 2 seconds of silence, Melissa whispered, "You need to check your personal email before they realize I warned you." Then she hung up. A cold feeling moved through my chest, not fear exactly, just recognition. Because people don't secretly help former coworkers unless they're already scared themselves. I refreshed my inbox and saw a forwarded internal email stamped confidential, sent only 23 minutes earlier. Subject line, immediate containment strategy. And my name appeared 3 times before I even opened it. I read the email twice before the elevator camera footage attached underneath finally made my stomach tighten. The subject line alone sounded less like corporate procedure and more like crisis management after a crime scene. Immediate containment strategy regarding former employee Natalie Harper. Former employee. It had been less than an hour since I left the building. Richard's message to executive leadership was short, cold, and dangerously specific. "We need confirmation that all legacy system access tied to Harper has been permanently disabled before diligence review begins Monday." Below that, someone from legal responded, "Do not engage further unless necessary. If she retained archived reporting copies, we need to know immediately." Then came the attachment. Security footage from the underground records room dated March 14 at 9:42 p.m., me entering with 2 banker boxes in my arms during the compliance review project Richard publicly praised me for leading. They were already building a narrative. I leaned back against the driver's seat and closed my eyes for a second, replaying every strange interaction from the last month. Melissa suddenly asking whether I still worked late in records. Denise requesting duplicate signatures for documents she normally approved electronically. Richard insisting I stop communicating with vendors directly and focus on internal strategy. None of it had been random. They'd been isolating me carefully, piece by piece, preparing a version of events where I looked reckless enough to blame if the acquisition auditors discovered missing money. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Melissa. "They think you copied files." I stared at the message before replying with one sentence. "Did they?" 3 dots appeared instantly, disappeared, then returned again. Finally she wrote, "Richard's terrified." I almost laughed at that because fear changes powerful people faster than guilt ever does. Back upstairs inside Aldervane's executive floor, I knew exactly what was happening. Richard was pacing between conference rooms pretending to coordinate damage control while executives quietly realized their merger bonuses could disappear if the wrong documents surfaced before Monday's diligence review. And somewhere in that building, Melissa had decided protecting herself mattered more than protecting him. I drove home through heavy rain and carried the external drive into my apartment like it weighed 50 pounds instead of a few ounces. My building overlooked the river, and normally the lights reflecting against the water helped me think clearly after stressful days. That night they only reminded me how quickly stability disappears when someone powerful decides your silence is financially convenient. I changed into sweatpants, poured a glass of wine I never actually drank, and began organizing everything chronologically across my dining table. Vendor approvals. Internal reimbursements. Expense summaries. By midnight, one pattern became impossible to ignore. Every questionable transaction led back to a consulting company called Velcrest Advisory Group. The company received millions in approved vendor payments despite having almost no digital footprint beyond a basic website and a rented office address in Connecticut. Even stranger, Melissa approved several payment escalations despite lacking authorization authority at the time. At 12:17 a.m., another email arrived from an anonymous Proton mail address containing only one sentence: "Check who owns Velcrest." Attached underneath was a PDF copy of state incorporation records. My breathing slowed the moment I opened it. The listed managing partner wasn't Richard. It was Richard's brother-in-law, Daniel Mercer. Same home address. Same emergency contact number. Same private trust attached to tax filings. I sat there staring at the document while thunder rolled outside my windows because suddenly the entire structure became clear. The fake promotions. The rushed termination. The disappearing compliance files. They weren't covering isolated mistakes. They were laundering consulting payments through a family-controlled shell company before finalizing the merger. And based on the timestamps inside the executive emails, they believed I'd already figured it out. At 12:46 a.m., my apartment intercom rang unexpectedly. I froze. Nobody visited me that late. Then my phone lit up with Melissa's name. The second I answered, she whispered, "Don't open the door until you look through the hallway camera first." I muted the phone and opened the hallway security app connected to my apartment doorbell camera, expecting maybe a delivery mistake or a neighbor at the wrong unit. Instead, Richard stood outside my apartment in a charcoal overcoat with his hands shoved into his pockets while Denise from HR waited near the elevator pretending not to look nervous. My chest stayed calm, but something colder settled underneath it because executives do not show up at terminated employees' homes after midnight unless the situation has already become dangerous. Melissa whispered, "He left the office 20 minutes ago after legal refused to approve something he wanted signed tonight." I watched Richard glance toward my door again before checking his phone impatiently. Then another figure stepped off the elevator, Martin Klein, Aldervane's chief financial officer. That surprised me enough to make me sit forward. Martin almost never involved himself in personnel disputes. He was the kind of executive who delegated uncomfortable conversations to people beneath him and only appeared personally when the financial exposure became catastrophic. Through the camera feed, I saw Denise speaking rapidly while Martin kept his expression unreadable. Richard looked angry. Not stressed. Angry. Like a man losing control of a situation he thought he'd already buried. My phone vibrated again with a message from Melissa. "Richard thinks you still have the March reconciliation file." I looked toward the encrypted drive sitting on my dining table beside the incorporation records and finally understood why they were panicking. The March reconciliation file contained the internal ledger cross-check tying Velcrest payments directly to merger preparation expenses. If acquisition auditors saw it beside the shell company records, the entire deal could collapse before Monday morning. Richard knocked 3 times. Calm. Controlled. Corporate. The exact same tone he used during performance reviews before eliminating someone quietly. I didn't move toward the door. Instead, I opened my laptop and started recording the security feed locally. After another knock, Martin spoke for the first time. "Natalie, we'd prefer to resolve this privately." Privately. Interesting word choice. Not professionally. Not appropriately. Privately. Which meant they already understood this had crossed beyond ordinary termination territory. I finally answered through the intercom without unlocking anything. "It's after midnight." Richard stepped closer to the camera immediately. "There are concerns regarding confidential company materials." "Then legal can contact me tomorrow," I said calmly. For a second, nobody answered. Then Martin spoke again, quieter this time. "You were never supposed to be involved in any of this." That sentence told me more than he intended. Because innocent executives don't say things like that to former employees standing outside sealed apartment doors at 1 a.m. They say there's been a misunderstanding. They deny. They redirect. But Martin sounded exhausted. Like someone realizing too late that Richard's problem had become everybody's problem. Richard interrupted sharply. "We know you accessed archived reporting systems after termination." I leaned back against my kitchen counter and almost smiled. "So your security team missed it for months?" Silence. Another mistake. Because if this ever reached investigators, they'd now have proof the company knowingly ignored unsecured financial systems during an active merger review. Martin must have realized it too because he immediately cut Richard off. "Natalie, nobody wants escalation here." Outside my door, Denise looked close to panic. Inside my apartment, I quietly attached the encrypted drive to my secondary laptop and uploaded duplicate copies of every document to a cloud vault scheduled for automatic release if anything happened to the files locally. Years earlier, during a cybersecurity seminar, someone once said the safest leverage isn't destruction, it's distribution. The moment multiple people can expose the truth, threats lose value. My upload reached 72% when Richard suddenly lost patience. "You have no idea how badly this ends for you if those files leak." There it was. Not concern. Not negotiation. A threat. Clean. Direct. Recorded perfectly through my hallway audio feed. I looked at the timestamp in the corner of my laptop screen, 1:13 a.m. Then my phone buzzed with a new email notification from an unfamiliar address ending in the domain of the acquiring company overseeing the merger. Subject line, "Request for immediate confidential meeting." And beneath it, one sentence changed the entire balance of power. "We believe you may possess information relevant to our internal due diligence investigation." By 8:30 the next morning, I was sitting inside a private conference suite 42 floors above Midtown Manhattan across from 3 attorneys representing the acquiring firm, Belmere Holdings, while Richard's career quietly collapsed somewhere downtown in real time. Nobody offered coffee. Nobody wasted time pretending this was informal. The woman leading the meeting, Elise Warren, Belmere's senior compliance counsel, placed a yellow legal pad in front of her and asked the first question carefully. "Ms. Harper, when did you first suspect financial irregularities involving Velcrest Advisory Group?" Not if. When. Which meant they already knew enough to be dangerous. I handed over printed copies of the vendor records, reimbursement trails, shell company filings, and internal approval chains I organized overnight, each tabbed chronologically with timestamps and executive signatures highlighted in blue. Elise barely reacted while reviewing them, but the younger attorney beside her stopped typing twice after recognizing certain account transfers. Across the table, a forensic auditor quietly asked whether anyone from Aldervane contacted me outside normal termination procedure. I slid my phone forward, displaying the recorded hallway footage timestamped 1:13 a.m. Richard threatening me outside my apartment played clearly through the conference room speakers while Martin stood beside him looking trapped between fear and regret. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the recording ended. Finally Elise closed the folder slowly and said, "That was extremely unwise of them." By noon, Belmere formally suspended acquisition negotiations pending emergency investigation. At 1:47 p.m., Aldervane's internal employee directory temporarily crashed from traffic after executive access permissions started disappearing in waves. Melissa texted me first. Richard was escorted out. 10 minutes later another message arrived, Martin resigned. Then Denise. Federal investigators are here. I stared at the screen quietly from the window of the conference suite while rain moved across the city below like smoke drifting between buildings. 20 hours earlier they'd carried my belongings into a hallway before officially firing me. Now attorneys were sealing executive offices while auditors copied financial servers floor by floor. The speed of collapse almost felt unreal, but corporate corruption usually survives for years right until the moment someone documents it correctly. Belmere's attorneys offered me temporary legal protection, consulting compensation, and immunity agreements regarding archived data access. I accepted only after my lawyer reviewed everything personally that afternoon. Calm decisions matter more when powerful people begin panicking publicly. 3 weeks later, the story finally broke across financial media. Merger suspended amid internal fraud investigation at Aldervane Capital. Richard and Daniel Mercer became central figures in a federal inquiry involving fraudulent vendor contracts and concealed consulting transfers exceeding $14 million. Martin avoided charges by cooperating early. Denise quietly left the company before subpoenas expanded. Melissa sent me a message one evening saying simply, "I'm sorry I stayed quiet as long as I did." I never answered. Some apologies arrive only after survival becomes convenient. By October, Belmere offered me a senior operations role leading compliance restructuring for 3 regional divisions. Better salary. Equity options. My own department. During onboarding, Elise walked me past a glass executive office overlooking the river and smiled slightly. "This one's actually yours." The sentence hit harder than I expected because for months I'd replayed that moment of seeing strangers carry my belongings out of my office while Melissa stood inside pretending not to know what was happening. Humiliation changes shape when you survive long enough to watch the people who orchestrated it lose everything protecting the lie. On my first Friday in the new office, facilities delivered a small white orchid to my desk. Same kind I'd left behind at Aldervane. No note attached. I placed it beside the window carefully and looked out over the skyline while employees moved calmly through hallways that no longer felt hostile. The strange thing about power is that truly powerful people rarely raise their voices. They document. They wait. And when the moment finally arrives, they simply open the right folder. 6 months after the investigation began, I received one final email connected to Aldervane Capital. The building had been sold, most of the executive floor was under reconstruction, and several former employees were still involved in ongoing testimony reviews. Attached to the message was a simple inventory sheet listing personal belongings recovered during office clearance. At the bottom, under desk items, someone had typed, "White orchid plant, alive." I stared at that line longer than I expected to. Because in the end, that little plant survived the same way I did, quietly, without attention, while people around it underestimated how resilient something calm could actually be. Richard eventually disappeared from the finance industry completely. Martin relocated to a smaller consulting firm no major bank would publicly acknowledge. And me? I stopped explaining myself to rooms already committed to misunderstanding me. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't humiliation. It's stability. It's watching people who tried to erase you realize your silence was never weakness, it was restraint. If you've ever stayed calm while people underestimated you, subscribe. Because some stories deserve to be heard all the way to the end.